Okay. Now, we haven't had any questions in the chat. If you do have questions, please post in the chat, or just put your hand up on the room and ask. And I suppose I'll take chairman's prerogative. Sean, and this is a question to both of you. What is the one thing that you would rather your consultant didn't do? Or to Andy, what was the thing that you'd rather that your trainee, your junior, didn't do?
That's a really good question, Bob. I was ready for what would you rather they did do? But the didn't do is a tricky one, isn't it?
Let's go with did do. How do they make your life easier?
I think a lot of it, if I make, sorry, Andy, I've just got a point on the tip of my brain, which is, I think a lot of it comes down to organization in some sense. And that goes both ways, right? I think when you're doing a placement, especially if you think about clinical placements, sometimes they can be really short. They're sometimes 3-4 months, depending on what specialty you're in. It can be quite hard to know expectations, what you're potentially going to get out of a placement, what you want out of it. And I guess if your supervisor hasn't set the scene with you, or you haven't set the scene with them from the beginning, you could find yourself wasting the first couple of weeks or month or two, perhaps, and that could just lead to lack of, I guess, educational attainment. So yeah, organization, that's probably the thing I think about the most.
And Andy?
I think, so talking about what you would rather they didn't do.
No, well, if you'd rather take it, what your ideal junior would do.
I'd probably echo Sean, really, in that kind of having an understanding of the processes that they need to be kind of, I guess, getting through, but also coming with some kind of ideas and questions, I guess. So I guess if the opposite would be if somebody comes and expects the other person to fully know everything and to set all their goals for them, then that would feel a little bit worrying in that sense, or just a little bit of a kind of, well, actually, if we've only just met, how am I gonna set your goals for you, kind of thing. Yeah.
It's what strikes me is that there is a sort of mutuality to that Sean wants you to be organized and help him achieve his goals, but then the flip side, you'd like Sean to be organized and know what his goals are.
Yeah, I think as Sean was talking, because you were reflecting on what might I find helpful or positive, and they were almost mirror images, weren't they? Disorganized is frustrating, organized is empowering. But I think you're right that I think one of the things that is difficult is the personal dynamic of it. Because as Sean was saying, if you're in a 4-month dynamic, then there's a lot of intensity to that, and there's not a lot of time to connect. And actually understanding where someone's coming from and what their kind of strengths and weaknesses are can be quite challenging, I think, in that time. And I think as a trainee, it can be really quite stressful. And kind of going into this person, someone where there's a massive power dynamic. So I guess from a consultant point of view, I guess I would hope to try and connect with the person on a personal level as well, and kind of reassure them so that they're kind of aware that this is a kind of a two-way process in a way, but that you're trying to be supportive rather than judgmental. So that I guess they kind of, some of that stress of, what is this person on the top of the hierarchy thinking or doing, can be maybe alleviated a little bit.
Okay. Have you any reflection on that, Sean?
Yeah, I agree. And I've actually got a bit of a practical example, I guess, because I'm in ophthalmology, which is a really weird specialty where it's medical, but also surgical. And actually, I'm just looking at the audience members. There's actually an fellow ophthalmologist here, I know Pranish. And we've got in East of England something, do you know what? I think other specialties do this, something called a trainee passport. I don't know if that rings any bells with anyone. But basically, whenever we rotate, we update this 2-page document with actually, here's our surgical numbers for these procedures, here's our competencies for these lasers, this is what I'm lacking, and it's all mapped to our curriculum. Then when you move to a new hospital, your supervisors they usually see it before you meet them. So they kind of know where you are and what you need. And then you have that very natural conversation that follows to say, look, I can't do these lasers. I'd like to do a bit more of this and that. I haven't done these exams. That's what I'd like to do next. So I think that probably helps facilitate it, actually. But that's a system measure that's been put in place for my region. And that kind of encapsulates everyone and helps facilitate that discussion rather than leaving it to the trainee and supervisor to kind of find their own way around that conversation.
Have you ever had people though that you've always gone to with that and they've been unaware or, just kind of not on that wavelength or almost going left field and saying, oh, forget about that. We need you to do something off-piste from that structure?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Although I think some of that depends on what level you are. I think definitely early on, certainly that doesn't really matter so much, right? Because it's pretty much blank. Yeah. You have to do everything. Then it's where do you start? Yeah. I've got 6 months with you. Can I do everything, please? Doesn't really go. That's not a plan. Yeah. But then later on, I've certainly found people more receptive to it. And I've kind of said this here, for example, I need this and that. And they say, okay, well, we'll make that happen. And then that's really helped kind of pinpoint and it helps me as well, just to say, look, to my supervisors, I really want to do these things. I'm interested in this, but I need to do these things first. And that's kind of helped from a department level to facilitate what I need.
Andy alluded to the issue and the problem of power. Karen has a question. Would you like to ask it?
Yeah, I'm happy to just get my video on. Yeah, definitely. I mean, you've already touched on this and about not necessarily knowing what the expectations are, and the supportive nature of the relationship, albeit with some progression decisions, some judgments, some summative aspects to the relationship too. So I was just wondering if you be really interested in each of your reflections about in what ways the medical hierarchy is helpful as well as potentially unhelpful in relation to this relationships. And, I wonder if, we often talk negatively about the medical hierarchy, and potentially that being a barrier to a relationship. But I wonder if at times it is helpful too. But I'd be interested in both of your thoughts about that.
Do you want to go first, Andy? Andy, okay, Andy's gesture to me. No, I think that's a really good question. And I don't know if you agree with me on this, Andy, but perhaps it feels like the medical hierarchy has become more flexible as the years gone by to some degree. I don't know if that's true of everywhere. And certainly a lot of my consultants are quite friendly and approachable. And that's because ophthalmology is obviously the best specialty. No. People are generally quite very approachable. And that really helps in the sense that it makes you comfortable to go and talk to them and ask them for advice about X, Y, Z, clinical research, education, etc. But at the same time, I don't know, Andy, if you've felt this since you've transitioned to the consultant post, there is a degree of expectation maybe for the trainee that they kind of, certainly I feel reassured by my seniors being present, my senior being the experienced person, a consultant kind of knowing what to do, what to say, and going to them for guidance. I don't know, there probably is a balance. And I'm sure depending on the situation, the hierarchy flips a bit, right? Whether it's flat or steep, and depending on the clinical scenario, or in this case, educational needs. I don't know.
Yeah, and I guess I'm kind of aware that, we're facilitating a discussion. I am a white male kind of person, so my experience of a medical hierarchy would have been very different to someone of a different gender, different ethnicity. And so I guess without being able to give any experience of that, I'm very much aware that there were people who say, well, actually, there's different levels of unhelpful and helpful. I guess helpful stuff, it didn't happen very often, but occasionally you just get some nice reassurance. I think like you were saying, Sean, so as a very junior doctor, as an FY1, kind of having struggling with some of the logistics of getting through the tick boxes of certain bits, but then having a few consultant colleagues kind of reassuring that we've got your back, but that, we know you're working hard. You do have to do this stuff, but actually we're reassured, and so they couldn't allow you to go through without completing stuff, but they could give you that reassurance that actually, not just on a tick box exercise, but on a doctory kind of level, because I guess there's an element of, I just want to get through this, but there's also an element of, oh gosh, am I doing all right? Am I doing all right? Am I terrifying the coroners and that kind of thing? So I think there was a few times where that was a kind of reassuring thing. And I guess the unhelpful dynamic is whenever I guess you feel like that power is being used in a way that is either inhibiting you achieve certain goals, so whether or not people are not allowing you to do certain things, or whether or not it's almost like a passive thing of you're trying to promote, you're trying to be proactive, for example, and the other person is just kind of, without, you haven't got any levers to kind of push them to maybe do your sign-offs or do your things, so you're kind of stuck kind of in the middle of that scenario.
I think that's a really interesting point, that last bit you mentioned, in terms of that sign-off and expectations sometimes, perhaps, right? I'm not sure if I'm answering any more, sorry, Karen, your question about hierarchy. I may have been going on a tangent here, which is that kind of, I think that comes back to us sort of setting the scene between the supervisor and supervisee, if that's the word. Kind of whether that's in a specific clinic, right? It might be the trainee comes to you, or it might be I come to you and say, it would be great if we can do a CPD today, but it's not too busy, or like beginning of a list, say, look, I'd love to do these cases, this one's challenging, but can I have go at it, or that sort of thing. And then on the broader scope, the beginning of a rotation, I'd like to do X, Y, Z. I don't know, maybe that plays into it, isn't it? Is that relationship from the beginning?
I think as well, like reflecting on some of these things, like I'm looking back at some of these processes, 20 years kind of on, and particularly in the early years, your maturity as a person and as an adult is so much different. And if you are struggling to process all of your life in your early 20s and that kind of thing, I think it can feel really daunting. So on a professional level, you could go to a nice talk like this and say, well, be proactive, come with some action points, come with some plans, kind of But if on an emotional level, you're kind of processing things and you're coming to meet people and feeling daunted by it, or then actually that's another factor that can be really hard. And I'm not sure, apart from peer support and stuff, it's kind of tricky to know how you navigate that if you're feeling just daunted by kind of seeking help or asking for help. Kind of ironically, I harassed Bob many years ago to ask for some support, but actually I was probably in that phase still of that kind of, on paper I had a training number and I was doing a master's and it was all looking great, but within that I was still very formative. And there were times probably when I came to a house, Bob, and I was like, oh gosh, I hope he doesn't think I'm just like bullying him, because it was really helpful to me, but I was still feeling a bit anxious about harassing this poor guy who just had ASME next to his email, kind of.
I have been more harassed quite often. Okay. Now, I'm very aware that there are other people in the room, and you may have other perceptions of issues and events within the trainer-trainee relationship. And you don't need to have questions. You just may have observations, and those observations of themselves can be very useful. Pranish.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Thanks, Andy and Sean, for the insights. So I've been at the receiving end, I've been at both the ends. I've been a supervisor for my trainees back in India, and here I am at the receiving end. The roles have reversed. So now I have consultants supervising me. So I think it's all about establishing that support, like what you guys have been saying, and trying to see what the supervisor expects from me, I think that goes a long way. We need to see really what's working. My concern is this. So here, for example, I'm here, and my consultant is expecting something out of me. Let's say that's something, maybe seeing more patients or being more proactive in certain aspects. That's one aspect. And I am expecting something from my consultant. Could be more theaters, more chances and opportunities. Fortunately, if both are going to be the same, what I'm expecting from my supervisor and what they're expecting from me, when both are same, that's a win-win. That's a great thing. But if not, there's a bit of a conflict there. So there comes a dilemma where how much should I give? Should I keep on giving what my consultant wants, but when the consultant doesn't give me what I'm expecting? So there's a bit of a disappointment or a trust issue is going to develop there. So how do you guys want to, would advise me how to go about this? I know it's a very sensitive question to ask, but yeah.
No, it's good to see you, Pranesh. I think, Andy, I don't know if you have any, do you need a minute to think? Because Pranesh's situation is probably, because Pranesh is also ophthalmology.
Yeah.
This is a disclaimer.
Well, to be honest, my geeky side of me is actually really fascinating because, as you said, you've come from a different system where you've switched places a couple of times. So your level of maybe insight, maybe what's the word, perspective and assertiveness internally is probably a lot higher than somebody that had a similar training number to you now and in years, because you've got all that extra experience. I kind of feel like pragmatically my thoughts would be there's a maybe a non-structured, almost, what's the word I want, like a social dynamic of you making a judgment of how much do I want to almost play a bit of a short-term game of almost like, how do people perceive me in this department? What is the kind of capital I can gain versus the risk of maybe making a challenge? So if you were stuck somewhere for a very short period of time, you might think, do you know what? It's probably better for me to get through this on nice terms with people, doing some positive things rather than getting really fractious. But actually, if you're going to be there for an extended period with a similar kind of relationship, that feels quite a risk and a challenge to you on your day-to-day, your work-life balance, but also on your, I guess, your career progression and what you're trying to achieve. And I guess in that second scenario, I guess this really scary stuff, but I guess that's when you would maybe be looking at outside of that dynamic of, so if your supervisor has a training program director and if they have a kind of deanery kind of component, that's when I guess you'd start to use that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you so much, Andy. Yeah, so the problem is we don't have a training program for an IMG who's coming here, and if I want to become a consultant and I don't have a training program existing there, there is an existing program called Caesar, but unfortunately it is not like a universal program, and not many universities or NHS centers are having that in practice, because that takes a while for. It's going to be a headache for the consultant because they have to kind of sign up and do that work. Yeah. So that's the problem actually. When there is no existing structure of curriculum or a training program is there, when compared to a trainee from UK, and that's where the problem arises. That's where this kind of conflict comes into play. Yeah.
Well, really good to hear that. Like, I'm kind of aware that people, international graduates, there is some rubbish. And more words much stronger than that you're contending with. I don't know what other support there is out there, actually. I imagine there would be some groups, but whether or not they can come in and sort things out for you. So do you kind of work for a trust rather than a deanery training?
Yes. Yeah. So I work for a trust. Then, so I'm. I think for trainees we have this HEE, Health Education England, is taking care of the training program, maybe. So we don't have such a program or a body which kind of governs our training.
Yeah.
That's well. I think of several points. First of all, this is a situation which I think more and more doctors are going to find themselves in, is on non-prescribed training pathways. I know a couple of people who are taking the CSER route deliberately to consultants, and that's a very different set of issues where you don't have the structures and the structures and the instructions that you have on the formal training pathway. But it's something I think we may need to think about more and see if there's anything else that we can do for people who are in similar situations. Sean, have you any thoughts about that? Well, my note I wrote down was lack of alignment between expectations.
Yeah. I mean, firstly, I agree with everything Andy said, actually. And I think it's not an easy situation to be in when perhaps you're right, there's a bit of differences in opinion or direction, perceived direction of the journey of the trainee from the trainee or supervisee. And specifically about kind of CSER, and that's what it is difficult because you don't necessarily have the same education supervisor who really looks after your overall broad training in the same way. I wonder if you might find that, because when we talk about consultant supervisors, right, I think maybe we've been talking about it in a singular fashion, but the truth is we all have multiple, don't we? There are different people who we get different things from, and how that looks depends on the unit you're at, depends on your personal relationship, and again, like Andy said, depends on your time frame in some ways with that department and what you want to get out of it. But I know you're in a difficult situation because, especially for CSER, I know some units are better than others, if that makes sense, in providing the structures required and support required to tick all the boxes and to get someone through all of that, whilst not impacting trainees or vice versa. But I guess my only point, in addition to what Andy said, is I think you've got more than one consultant supervisor, certainly. So I don't know, sometimes it's worth having conversations with people in a positive way to say, this is what I need. Is there any way? And often you find that people who are friendly are often receptive to try and help you, even if it's small steps to begin with. But it's not easy.
Okay. I'm very aware that the people who've joined this session may be looking for answers for particular problems or issues that have or are affecting them. And if you don't want to ask a question on open mic, please type it, and then I will ask the question anonymously for you. We can edit the transcript easily in the recording, and we can remove that if that's something that would make you more secure about answering or asking a particular question. So, one of the things that's fascinated me for years about supervisory relationships is that as a supervisor, I want my supervisee to show me their weaknesses, because it's their weaknesses that I'm most was the weaknesses that I was most interested in. It's by helping them with the weaknesses that I can make them better faster. But I'm also very aware that my supervisee is the last thing they want to do is to show me any weaknesses. Have you any thoughts about how to negotiate that particular minefield?
I think us medics, we're all quite competitive in some ways, I think. In a sense that I think through med school, especially through training years, and nowadays everyone has to jump through so many hoops, right? I think that perception of weakness and failure is a very interesting topic. And I think you're absolutely right, Bob. I think certainly if you ask that question in your first meeting with your trainee, you ask, when have you last, what have you last failed, or perhaps what are your weaknesses? You might not get a very honest answer or a very easy answer the first time you ask that, the first time you meet someone, right? I mean, certainly I would struggle to give you that answer.
Well, if you've been on enough courses, you get taught even to frame it as a success. There was that time when my research project was really struggling, and then I sorted it all out by the end. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interview technique, isn't it?
Yeah.
But that's a very interesting point. I'm sure that does come out, right, when you deepen that relationship between trainer and trainee, and things happen in training, etc. And it's important. But
yeah, I think it comes down to that security. This is one of the real challenges, isn't it? It's the intensity and the brevity of your interactions. So if you've got to kind of tick boxes over a short period of 3 or 4 months, as opposed to say 12 months or longer, and then that dynamic, I think the places where, as a trainee, I had the best kind of personal relationships, that was maybe easier to maybe discuss elements of what you were worried about, because you had that kind of security, perhaps. It might have been false security, I don't know, that you felt actually I can be a bit more emotionally honest about this and say, I think I'm doing okay here, but this stuff, keeps me up at night. I think that's really important, though, Bob, because the classic thing is as soon as you cross the threshold into the fabled holy land of being a trained person, all of a sudden, all of that stuff is suddenly like, well, actually, it's the things that you found really tricky that if you can avoid them all, well done you. But mostly they'll be there in some way, and then it's those grey areas that then become harder and harder. So I think you're right. I think we've got a cultural issue. I think within medicine as a not physicians, as in all of our world, as it were. And I think I would, if you can promote that in your dynamics with your supervisors, kind of in a way that you feel comfortable. So it might mean that don't show everything about how you're feeling, but you can be a bit more proactive about actually this is something I struggle with. I think that'd be really positive.
And that's perhaps a better way of phrasing things than is there anything you struggle with or I struggle with? And that two things that you mentioned there that are integral to it are honesty and trust.
And I think also we come back to that power dynamic. So, Pranesh, it sounds like to me you're kind of, if I can really trust this person, they've got a lot of power that could potentially help me. But then if I don't trust this person, actually, I really don't want to be showing them the bits of me that might make them think less of me, I guess. And that's really hard, really hard.
Karen, you're bringing a different lens to this conversation. Have you any reflections on these issues, your personal reflections? And you may wish to introduce yourself as well. Any personal reflections on power and trust and honesty, which are, light after dinner conversations.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Bob. I'm more than happy to. So I'm Karen Mattick. I'm based at the University of Exeter, and amongst one of my roles and interests to express is that I'm currently president of ASME, which is a new role and one I'm receiving support and mentorship for. I think the other thing to say about the roles I hold is that we lead a research project called Care Under Pressure, which is about the sort of well-being and support, sort of learning well-being and support in the workplace, particularly in hospital trusts, particularly doctors. And it's really interesting to hear the conversation and sort of reflect on the need for trust and how trust takes time to develop. A trusted relationship takes time to develop. And, we're talking about busy people in busy environments. So, catching time together to build that relationship of trust in which, gaps in knowledge, gaps in skills can be shared. And so that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, often medical training involves quite short rotations, and there's so there's limited time to build those relationships. Maybe there isn't that months and years to develop, and I guess there's also that tension of support and summative judgments that have to be made. So it is quite interesting. I mean, I guess so. I don't have a medical background, so I trained as a clinical scientist and then became an academic, I guess. So I'm a educator and researcher now, but I find it curious that postgraduate medical training involves so frequent rotations, and I can see some of the benefits of that, but also some of the downsides, I guess. And I guess that's something else. It would be interesting to hear from you. Clearly there are opportunities, exposure to a wider range of specialties and individuals and training environments, but are those frequent rotations also a barrier to building, sort of to getting the most out of some of these relationships, is what I'm wondering as you're talking.
It's an interesting reflection. One of my interests, my major academic work was in undergraduate education, and I've been proselytizing for longer and longer undergraduate placements and longitudinal integrated clerkships. I find it fascinating now that we've got LIFT, longitudinal integrated foundation training, which is taking lessons learned in undergraduate medicine and bringing them into postgraduate medicine. And it would be interesting to reorganize postgraduate specialty training as LIST, longitudinal integrated specialty training. We've even got the acronym. But it is somewhere where the trust and the honesty can start to build. The difficulty we have is that we have to work and learn and develop and grow within the environment we've got. One of the things Sean said is be aware that you don't have a single consultant, that there are multiple consultants. And so how acceptable would it be for a trainee who is having a challenging relationship with a particular consultant to seek his or her supervision from someone else?
That depends, I think, on quite a lot of factors, Bob. I think without getting into specifics, I like to think most deaneries are relatively supportive of trainees when, I don't know if you're mentioning specific interpersonal relationships or kind of, which might be what you're hinting at. I think most deaneries are pretty good. I'd like to think when these issues are raised, are supporting trainees through, though at least they are on paper. But also a lot of this, it depends on the individual, doesn't it? In terms of the trainee, what they're like as a person. Do they reach out to their ES? Do they reach out to X, Y, Z? And a lot of it depends on the department they're in. And I think I'm the most junior person in this room. One of the things that I've only learned very recently to say, is no. In a sense, that's all about building relationship and trust. I think I've only very recently learned especially when there's expectations, perhaps, to do, whether it's research, whether it's projects. Actually, sometimes to build a relationship in a positive way, politely saying no is better, if that makes sense. And actually, when you have that supervisor who's perhaps, is a bit receptive and open to it, and actually saying, oh, hang on, I know you want to do this and this and this, but actually I can't because of these commitments or something like that. I found actually most people appreciate the honesty up front, and often that honesty leads to then a more understanding relationship on both sides. But it's so individual to the circumstance.
Andy, how would you feel if you had a trainee or a junior who seemed to be seeking support from another consultant colleague?
I guess when you asked that question, I kind of had a slightly different thought in my head. So pragmatically, if you are on an attachment, like you said, that's relatively short, and your rota might mean that your nominal consultant you don't work with very much, but another consultant you can. I think all of us would be quite pragmatic and kind of that would be reasonable and positive. I guess if you're talking about maybe a supervisory dynamic which you feel is, I don't know, like really toxic or really, you know, there's some really massive, the kind of problem where you might say, I really can't work with this person because our dynamic or whatever. I think that would be very different. I guess that would be like probably quite a daunting bit of seeking help within the deanery, within whatever other structures you've got to kind of really, and I think that would feel like potentially quite a challenging thing to do, because I guess going back to Karen's question about the hierarchy and the medical power, that if you've potentially got such a clash of people that the person with all the power can maybe twist the story, and so it'd be quite scary as the trainee to be trying to seek help within that. I can think it's really bad, isn't it? Because I mean, I was very fortunate with lots of the people I work with, and it sounds like you have been, Sean. But actually, when you see things on social media about really horrible things, actually, I've heard of those as well. I can remember a colleague who'd the easiest way for them to change that dynamic was to change deanery, was to kind of leave a training zone. And that involved them increasing the amount of traveling that they were doing and lots of things like that. So I think depending on the dynamics and the local stuff, sometimes that can be really quite old-fashioned and not nice at all, unfortunately. But if I was some form of supervisor for someone and they said, oh, I've been doing loads with this person, it would probably be almost pragmatically, all right, well, what we'll do is I'll have a really good chat with them, or we can include them in our end of whatever chats kind of thing to kind of help it and help promote it, rather than they probably wouldn't have the time to swap somebody in a 4-month rotation.
Okay, I think we're coming up to 45, 5:45. We intend these to run for 45 minutes, so we'll pull it to a conclusion. And my conclusion is that, to quote the first line of Anna Karenina, that all happy families are similar, but all unhappy families are unique. But there are more happy families than unhappy families. We hear about the dysfunctional relationships, but we don't hear about the many more functional relationships. And I think one of the things is, for me, that's come out of this, and I hope it will come out of this, that to get the best from your supervisor, you need to be put the best in as a trainee, as a supervisee. And what you bring to the table is very much helps to grow what you take away from the table at the end of your placement. Trust, honesty are very important. And I enjoyed the reflections on power, because I hope that medicine is trying to depower the relationships. The extent to which we're succeeding is moot, but I think I certainly spent my career trying to unpower my relationships, and I'm find more and more people who've been trying to do the same, but that is not always obvious to everyone. So
if I could just add to that, Bob, I'm aware that we've got a couple of people that haven't kind of spoken, and I think if you're early in your career and you're early in, like, if you're trying to promote yourself and you're trying to not promote, if you're trying to show proactivity and be organized and stuff, but actually you're being overwhelmed by your clinical demands, particularly early on, especially if you often hospital settings and rotas and nights, actually that point of stepping off, using maybe a time out of program or time in between training programs, I think it can feel like, oh, maybe I'm struggling, but actually it's so intense, particularly post-pandemic, that I try and empower people that if you think it's good for you to take a break, to then allow you to figure out how to be more you and to be more, I guess, organized about your curriculum and all those things. I think that's also really acceptable and positive. So.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Andy. He says, don't be afraid of timeout. Time out can be a very good thing. Okay, just before we leave, the last thing is our next session is, I think, on a week today. It's next week, on how to get the best from your research supervisor. And we'll have hopefully a similar format, and we may see some of you there. But if not, thank you for your time and your presence and your contributions. And a special thank you to Andy and Sean. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Good night, everyone.